This is what most people imagine when they picture a Roman statue, the beautiful white marble. But in ancient Roman times, marble statues were painted with really vivid colours, looking something like this, which is a reproduction of this real Roman statue of the Emperor Caligula. And quite frankly, this looks rather jarring to the modern audience who is used to seeing an austere white portrait of a Roman. And there's a good reason why most people think of this. I mean, when you go to a museum of ancient Roman artifacts, we see white marble statues. But that's just because the paint has worn away over hundreds of years of being in the ground, or often they were overwashed by overzealous archaeologists in the past who were expecting to find a white marble statue. During the Renaissance in Europe, when sculptors were seeing Roman statues come out of the ground, they thought they were white because, as I said earlier, the paint had worn off, and they reproduced this. And this kind of distorts our image of what ancient Roman statues would have looked like. The Renaissance artists didn't typically paint their marble statues, and that has kind of seeped into our narrative of what ancient Roman statues would have looked like too. These Renaissance sculptors like Da Vinci and Michelangelo replicated and often improved upon these Roman statues, but they missed the key element of colour, which was really important to the Romans, who really valued realism in their art, particularly in their statues. If you saw a marble bust of the emperor in the Roman Forum, for example, you would expect him to look realistic. Yes, he would have been idealised, he would have been made to look like a hero, but you would expect his colour palette to match his real life complexion. But you may be wondering, if the paint always wears away, how do we actually know that ancient Roman statues were painted at all? Well, there are three main bodies of evidence that help us prove that ancient Roman statues, and ancient statues in general for that matter, were painted. The first body of evidence are the archaeological remains of statues themselves. Now, most of the paint wears away, but some of it survives, often the more darker tones, the darker pigments, which are seen in the crevices of the statues that don't get eroded or worn away by any kind of biological activity in the ground. You often see it in the folds of a Roman toga, for example. You can see some of the colours here particularly. Now, archaeologists and art historians can examine these pigments and try to replicate what that may look like in a reproduction. Some of these reproductions are more real to life. For example, the one I showed you earlier of the Emperor Caligula gives a fairly realistic colour palette of what the emperor may have looked like, whereas this depiction of the Emperor Augustus looks rather garish indeed, and they haven't included any shading or highlights. But it should be remembered that this is a 3D object, it's not a 2D object, so perhaps you don't need to deliberately add the shading because that would be provided by real lighting and shadowy conditions. For example, the sun in the sky or oil lamps providing light and shadow. Here is another example of this famous portrait of Augustus, this time possibly more realistically composed. But it should be mentioned here that this is all speculation about the precise colours used on this particular portrait. We don't know because the original colours have almost completely vanished. This is a reconstruction based on more of a realistic interpretation. This is one based on more of a garish interpretation. But that is not to say the Romans would have preferred this one to this one. We simply don't really know. The second body of evidence are wall paintings, particularly from places like Pompeii. As most of us already know, Pompeii was covered in huge amounts of volcanic ash from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, which preserved a city in situ, which is almost totally unique, if you exclude Herculaneum, of course. But it should be noted here that this isn't like a city in a time capsule. It is a city that was being abandoned, that was covered in ash. So a lot of the movable and transportable goods, statues for example, may have already been taken away by the time the city was entirely covered. But what you can't take away is a wall. So a lot of the painted decorations on the wall have survived because no one was able to remove them, unlike other forms of art which have completely vanished. One really key element to Roman wall painting was to paint in furniture and architectural elements that weren't actually there to provide added depth and detail. One example of this would be to include a painted column, for example, instead of a real column. This was a great cost-saving method that would kind of give the illusion of more wealth and depth in your room. But they did the same things with statues. A rich household might expect to have a statue of Venus, for example, or you could just paint it onto your wall like this. We can see quite clearly that this statue is painted, and actually the colours do look slightly garish. Admittedly, that's because it has been under volcanic ash for many hundreds of years, so we can't be 100% sure that these were the original colours, but you get the idea, they were definitely painted. The final body of evidence is the written evidence left behind by the ancient Romans. What I'm about to read to you is an extract from Plutarch, who wrote a book called Parallel Lives, where he was comparing noble Greeks and Romans to each other in order to kind of get a moral gauge of where society came from and where it was heading. In his biography of the Roman dictator Sulla, he says the following: "His personal appearance in general is given by his statues, but the gleam of his grey eyes, which was terribly sharp and powerful, was rendered even more fearful by the complexion of his face, which was covered in coarse blotches of red interspersed with white. For this reason, they say, his surname was given him because of his complexion." Plutarch later describes him as having golden hair, and these are only things that you would have known from examining Sulla's marble statues, which weren't white, they were painted realistically. So there you have it, Roman marble statues were actually painted, unlike their Renaissance descendants. This is somewhat of an open secret among archaeologists, and it's not as though we try to keep this covered up, it's just that in TV, films and other forms of popular culture, it's depicted that Roman statues were white marble and they weren't painted. You know, ironically, Family Guy depicted this really well when they showed parts of the Trojan War. They showed painted statues, which is very realistic. Well done, Family Guy.